Meanwhile, Yeonwoo's face showed intense fear and hopelessness. His abuser made a nasty smile and said that it was all his fault. Behind him were other gang members. They were significantly outnumbered, but Yeonwoo's strength was winning. The teenager said that he would forgive them if they stopped behaving like that, because Yeonwoo was infected. Then the two gang members started arguing with each other about what the teenager had said to them. Then the girl who had started the whole mess intervened and stopped the argument with a shout. She ordered them to stop quarreling and deal with Yeonwoo in high-pitched tones. Otherwise, no one knew what could have happened. Then the guy who was making the fire took the initiative. He held a fire to Yeonwoo and asked if he wanted to play. But the teenager was silent and did not even look up. He realized that fire was really something that could kill him. After that, Yeonwoo tried to move his hands and feel the power in them and his actions. Then the teenager spoke. His voice was calm and confident, and because of this, the smug expression on the offender's face disappeared. Yeonwoo said that it was very uncomfortable with his hands tied. But this is the only way to kill an infected person. Then, virus cells appeared on the offender's face. After that, Yeonwoo finally looked up and suggested starting with this guy. Meanwhile, Choy and the teenagers were no better off. The gang mocked the homeless man because they did not see him as a real threat, because they were outnumbered. Choy held his ground and showed no signs of fear. Then a guy in a green suit holding Park Min asked if it was his father, because he looked like a homeless man. At that moment, someone called out to the smug, impudent man. It turned out that it was Choy, and he hit the guy so hard that he flew away. The offender was no longer so smug, and Choy asked if he wanted to take his hand away from Park Min. The guy in the green suit was approached by his other friends and asked if he was okay. One of them brought his partner up and asked Choy what he was doing. The homeless man got angry about this and said that they were getting what they deserved. Then, the gang prepared for a fight, and they took up combat positions. Choy noticed this and told the brave souls to approach only in a crowd. A fierce battle ensued. Everyone attacked the homeless man at once, but Choy was skillful and repelled their attacks. The guy who was supporting his partner in the green suit was very scared when he saw his gang being smashed like children. And then he yelled at Choy, saying that they could have fought back. When he was about to attack, someone called out to him. The offender's eyes became the size of a penny. It was Choy, and he told the brave man in a confident voice that he was giving him the last chance to escape. But the boy did not listen, and told the man not to force him to use force. But at that moment, Choy had already punched the bandit in the face with all his might. Behind him was a path of all the defeated brave men. At that moment, Choy heard a familiar voice shouting for help. It was Seo-young, and she was grabbed by the guy with the bottle. He told Choy that he had hurt the wrong person. The man panicked and ordered the offender to stop, offering to talk in exchange. But the guy kept a bottle of virus cells near Seo-young and threatened to infect the girl if Choy made a move. And then he asked if it would be cute if Soyon became a monster and called the girl a woman of easy virtue. Then behind him, someone shouted that he had gone crazy. It was Yeonwoo's father. The man attacked the offender from behind, ordering him to stop immediately. He was very angry and just furious. He said that the offender had met a soldier on his way, so that was the end for him. The bandit was not expecting such an attack and shouted at the man to let him go, threatening him with eggs. But Yeonwoo's father did not respond to his empty words and simply threw the bottle of cells out of the bandit's hands. The open container fell to the ground and the liquid inside spilled out. The bottle landed next to the boys who were lying on the ground. The bandit who was closest to these cells looked away at the bottle. Then he saw his hand covered with these eggs. The guy screamed, and the cells on his arm began to throw themselves at other gang members. Soyeon's offender saw this and started running away, apologizing to his partners for it. But he couldn't get far because a bat was waiting for him. It was Park Min, who hit the bastard so hard in the face that he flew away. Meanwhile, the company looked at the gang's photos on social media. They looked very cool there, but in real life it was exactly the opposite. Soyon, the offender, was sitting unconscious behind him. Yeonwoo's father said he was disgusted to see it. Park Min assumed that the gang was local, and they were in the business of killing people and filming it, thinking it was funny. The teenager then said that they were crazy bastards, and asked how Lee Yeon-woo could have fallen for these assholes. The teenager's father was hurt by these words and was silent for a second. Then he looked at the offender Soyon and scolded him. The man came closer to the milkman, grabbed him by the collar and demanded to know what had happened to Yeon-woo. The father yelled at the boy, demanding to know whether they had touched his son. The offender began to come to a little bit of consciousness and slightly opened his eyes, but continued to be silent without saying a word. Choy approached the man and asked him to calm down and not go crazy. Meanwhile, Soyon stood in the corner and looked at the washing machines. Park Min noticed this and looked at the girl carefully. Soyon was completely absorbed in her thoughts and did not pay attention to what was happening around her. The girl looked at her reflection in the glass of the washing machine and memories came flooding back to her. At that time, Yeon-woo's hand was dripping with virus cells and he was saying terrible things, as horrible as his actions. Soyeon was in a stupor and did not know how to react to her friend. Yeon-woo said he now understood why they couldn't go together. Suddenly, Soyoung's memories were interrupted by Park Min, who asked the girl if she had calmed down, saying that everything would be fine. But the girl remained silent. So the guy asked her further why Soyeon was standing there alone, since she had just been rescued. Soyeon remained silent. Then Park Min asked what was really bothering him. When would he get his pills back because he needed them immediately? Soyeon did not even look in his direction, ignored him. Park Min continued to whine about how he couldn't wait any longer. Then she started rummaging through her bag. Then she just threw the pills at Park Min, not even listening to him. The guy's only response to this was how unexpectedly it all happened. Soyeon continued not to look at the teenager and only apologized. And then she added that Park Min could have taken them away. Seo Young's voice was completely indifferent. The teenager turned and looked at the girl. She had no face. So Young said she was always thinking about how to help Yeon-woo and even wanted to go with him. After that, Soyeon suddenly started crying when she remembered what happened to Yeon-woo's mom and said how sorry she was. Park Min turned to the girl and asked her what had happened, but she was already crying hard, covering her face with her hands. The teenager thought that he thought So Young was just pretending to be nice, but it seems that she was really close to that bastard Yeon-woo. Then Park Min went over to Seo Young, hugged her and calmed her down, asking if she really wanted to leave Yeon-woo like that. He said very nice things, saying that they were all here to help him, and even though they didn't get along very well, Yeon-woo's father decided to bring them together to help the teenager. Park Min looked into Park Seo Young's crying eyes and said that he would help them. Then he looked away as if he was remembering something, saying that he owed a lot to Yeon-woo. Meanwhile, the men were sorting things out in the other corner of the room. Choy suggested that So Young look at a place on the map. Meanwhile, Park Min was watching and analyzing everyone. He noticed that Yeon-woo's father and Choy were fighting well with their fists. Park Seo Young was also able to defend herself, and she was sincerely worried about the teenager. Suddenly, a smile appeared on Park Min's face, indicating that he had a plan. Meanwhile, screams were heard in the room where Yeon-woo and the gang were staying. The guy who had the virus and the cells started screaming, looking at his hands and dropped fire from them. The other two arrogant gang members looked on in horror. They decided that Yeon-woo had infected his partner. But the teenager just sat there doing nothing, not even raising his head much. The guy offered to set Yeonva on fire because he didn't know what to do and how to save himself. The teenager heard everything that was happening, but he was absorbed in his thoughts and concentrated on his strength. The offender was lying on the ground under his feet, screaming in pain. Yeon-woo was still trying to control him. The teenager could not use his hands, and the cells that were far away were poorly controlled by him. Yeon-woo realized that he had to get his hands on something and decided to try one method. Suddenly, the teenager felt that when the abuser approached him, he was in control, so there was a difference of 2 meters. Then, if the cells connect with each other, what happened could happen. Meanwhile, 2 gang members with torches attacked Yeonva with shouts and fire. They threw them at him, saying that the teenager was burning in hell, but Yeon-woo dodged. He managed to get out and touch the offender with his hand and used his cells to shield himself from the fire like a shield. The gang members were simply shocked by what had happened, so they froze in a stupor. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo had gotten out and was even able to stand up, and his offender was on fire. The teenager realized that he could change the shape of the cells by contacting them. In the Khan River, that person could also do it. Meanwhile, another guy in a white shirt intervened in the fight and told the others that they had to finish off Yeonva. Suddenly, the teenager called him by the name of Chun-sik, and for some reason, Yeon-woo knew him. When the boy responded to him, his body suddenly became infected with cells and pierced as if with a needle. Yeon-woo held up his fingers in the shape of a gun, saying that he would have to just destroy them all. The teenager held himself with dignity, his voice sounded very confident and calm, and he added that they were all cockroaches and had to be exterminated. Yeon-woo looked at the frightened, once smug idiots and said that they had no reason to run away. A smile appeared on his face, and the teenager said that from now on, they were all his slaves. Everyone else started running away after these words in terror and screaming. Meanwhile, Yeonwoo was just calmly, slowly removing the rest of the tape. After that, he asked the gang where they were all running off to. The teenager reminded them that he said there was no point in running away. Chukshin was lying on the floor. He turned to Yeonwoo and screamed in fear. The teenager said with sarcasm how sorry he was. Then he pointed his hand at the boy and gave a command. Yeonwoo raised Chukshin's head and asked if he had seen. The teenager wanted to show what kind of people the boy had gotten involved with, because they had just abandoned him. Yeonwoo shouted directly at the scum his partners were, and added that he knew what it was like to be betrayed, and therefore offered to take revenge on them. And then he added that Chukseong's body would no longer be the same, but instead, he would take revenge on the traitors. Meanwhile, the other offenders ran away without looking back, but the guy in the black hoodie noticed something strange behind him. His partner was attacked by cells like tentacles. The guy stopped and fell down in fear, but tried to get up immediately and run away. His partner asked him to remove the cages, but he just turned around and wasn't going to do anything. The boy looked at Yeonwoo, who had disfigured his friend's face and mocked him, apologizing for his actions. He realized that he was facing a real monster and had already regretted getting involved with him 1,000 times. Yeonwoo noticed this look on him and asked him what he was doing. The teenager asked if the boy was planning to escape, and then ordered the cages to attack him. It was the turn of the guy in the gas mask, who was lying on the floor trying to get up. Suddenly, the guy heard someone behind him laughing, saying that the bandit was only pretending to be strong. The offender looked at Yeonwoo and asked him if he felt afraid of him now. Yeonwoo wanted the gangster to understand why this was happening to him, so that he would feel guilty. The teenager asked if he had fun when he infected others. He went on to say that in such situations, the true nature of a person could be exposed, and how ironic that was. Yeonwoo said that now the bandit was standing in front of him and looking at him with completely different eyes. Then he asked if the offender was feeling afraid now. The bandit fell to the floor, covered himself with his hands, and began to apologize and beg for alms. Yeonwoo sat down and with a smile, or was the guy serious now, pointed his hand at him, making a gun. The bandit said he would make sure his friends were safe. Yeonwoo just laughed it off, saying that everything was fine and he would just pay him back. Suddenly, the teenager felt very sick. He felt a sharp pain inside. Yeonwoo leaned over and just fell to the floor, while the others were frightened and covered themselves with their hands. The teenager began to shake. It hadn't happened to him for a long time, and no one understood what was happening to him. The girl got up, approached the guy in the gas mask and asked what was going on. Yeonwoo turned back and saw that all his monsters were on fire. And then the teenager realized that he felt the pain of that monster. This was bad because Yeonwoo became vulnerable, but the teenager could not understand why he felt his pain. And if he did not understand, he would not be able to solve this problem. At that moment, Yeonwoo lost his focus and something terrible happened. The guy attacked him and kicked him in the face, which knocked Yeonwoo backwards. The teenager fell down and recoiled loudly because he did not expect such a blow. Then the guy came up and hit Yeonwoo again and ordered his partner Park Jun to leave. The boy and the girl shouted excitedly and were happy that they had a chance to escape and be saved. Chun fell behind Yeonwoo and began to run away with the rest of the survivors. The teenager was lying on the floor and could not do anything, holding his arm. He could only raise his head and look at these scum who were running away without punishment. The gang ran out of the room and fled as far as the eye could see. Park Jun asked if anyone had a phone with them. Yeonwoo walked to the edge and looked at where the bandits were running away. But the offenders managed to run away and hide, and were nowhere to be seen. The gang stopped to take a break because they couldn't run that long. It wasn't part of the element of cool. When the gang ran away far enough, they were already on foot, and the girl started shouting at the guys, telling them to deal with Yeonwoo quickly. She was angry and blamed them for everything that happened. Then Chun came back and ordered them to stop screaming, otherwise they would be found quickly, because Yeonwoo would not leave them alone. After that, the gang started quarreling, arguing that Yeonwoo would persecute them all. Then Park Jun intervened, ordering him to stop shouting and listen to him. The guy picked up the phone and said that now they had to destroy Yeonwoo. He said he had something and it was nuclear explosives. They began to think about whether to use it on Yeonwoo and discussed it so loudly that they didn't notice what they had found for her. Then the guys started discussing among themselves and decided to launch a stream. Suddenly, Park Jun stopped and shouted that he had finally remembered his name. At that moment, Yeon-woo called out to them and asked why they were standing there. The teenager stood and said with a smile that he thought they had gotten far. But it turned out that the gang was much dumber than Yeon-woo thought. The offenders began to panic and scream, and the teenager said that he had warned them. Yeon-woo started to come down and said that there were cells in his body that, when touched by humans, turned them into monsters. He asked if the gang really thought he was joking. Yeon-woo went on to ask that the perpetrators were afraid of being infected themselves. Then Park Jun held out his hand and asked me to wait a bit, because he really needed to tell him something. He said they were really terrible people and even people like them shouldn't have lived, but he promised that he would protect Yeonwa's friends. Park Jun promised that he would stop being a scumbag, and then the boy added that he also remembered that one of his classmates also said that he was from Kyonan and from the same school as him. But Yeon-woo called him crazy and added that he would not believe him. Park Jun began to panic and swore that it was true and that he had heard it himself. Suddenly, the boy said that his classmate Yeon-woo was talking about a school trip and that his friends had abandoned him. The teenager realized that he could not have learned this simply from a school pass. Meanwhile, strange things were happening in the city near the church. A woman stood next to her and called on everyone to join them. They were dressed in dark suits and handed out advertisements. Inside was an ordinary church, and people were praying and behaving as usual. Among them were young people. After the service, humanitarian aid in the form of food was distributed to everyone. There were a lot of people because everyone wanted to get free help and food. At the end of the room, there was a crowd of people who were not in uniform. It turned out that they were Yeon-woo's classmates. Next to them was a group of young people who prayed before eating. Then one of the teenagers asked if they should have prayed as well. Isuri said that the food might spoil before they finished praying. Seon-young was outraged and asked them to stop arguing and just start eating. Kang Ji-hoon stood there just looking at the floor and then looked up. Then he just took off, and Kang Min noticed. They went down the stairs because they wanted to be alone. Kang Ming asked how long Kang Ji-hoon had been going on like this and ordered him to come to his senses. But the teenager was silent and just looked out the window. Then Kang Ji-hoon said he wanted to burn it. Kang Min asked what he wanted to burn. The teenager explained that there were a lot of people here and the cells were spreading. And Kang Ji-hoon thought about how to burn them all. Kang Ming said that these were very stupid thoughts. And then the teenager asked him again that it was pointless to wait for death. Kang Ji-hoon remained silent and just looked down at the street through the window. Downstairs, people were calling for people to join the church, and Kang Min told him to stop. He went on to say that he didn't know Han-mi well, but it wasn't Lee Yong-woo's fault, because it was an accident. He wasn't the kind of person who would just hurt someone. Kang Ji-hoon simply sent a friend in response and said that he would rather take care of everything himself without his help. Kang Min was silent, unable to say anything because Kang Ji-hoon continued to speak. The teenager said that Yeon-woo was no longer the classmate they knew. Meanwhile, the rest of the classmates were waiting for Kang Ji-hoon and Kang Min. Sung-yeon complained that her phone was about to die, but she kept looking at it, and then asked where they were going next. Isuri was sitting by herself, looking at something on her phone, when suddenly, thoughts came to her. She thought about the fact that only Park Seo-young and Park Min were not with them. But then where did that guy go? Park Choa said that she was fine here, and asked if they went back. She didn't know how they would get home. Isuri opened the blogger's channel on her phone and thought that they were probably looking for Jeonwoo. Suddenly, something caught the girl's attention. She saw a video on a channel called I Finally Saw a Person with Immunity. Meanwhile, on the street, church members were handing out their advertisements and calling on people to join them. There were many people at the entrance, and a pleasant atmosphere of love reigned. Others also distributed water and food free of charge to passers-by and anyone else who wanted it. The woman in glasses and a brown suit suddenly noticed something, and her expression changed dramatically. The soldiers patrolling next to them also noticed this. A church member named Kwon Di fell behind the soldiers. The soldiers immediately began to approach them, thinking they were infected. But her friend said that the girl had a chronic illness. He explained that Kwon Di had colon cancer, and even in the hospital she was told that she could not be saved. The girl fell to the ground, folded her arms, and was shaking, but the military seemed to believe them. Kwon Di prayed without stopping, as her friend advised her. Meanwhile, Kang Min and Kang Ji-hoon were discussing Lee Yong-woo and what had happened to him. It seemed that Kang Min was beginning to believe that their classmate had changed. and not for the better. Kang Ji-hoon was all in his thoughts and did not listen to what his friend was saying. The boy recalled Ji-han Hyun's words, who said that Kang Ji-hoon looked at himself from the outside because he was putting his friend in danger. Then, the guy just turned around and left without saying anything to Kang Min. The boy was surprised by his friend's strange behavior, but he accepted it and ran after Kang Ji-hoon. Kang Min asked him to listen, saying that they could help Yeon-woo because the cells were dying at high temperatures. He went on to say that the risk was now too great to simply burn them with fire. Kang Min meant that there were several ways. Then Kang Ji-hoon stopped and interrupted his friend, asking if he was serious. He asked if Kang Min really wanted to help Lee Young-woo, and this question stunned his friend. Suddenly, the teenager remembered a conversation with Isuri when they got out of the car. The girl asked him if he was a fool. Isuri asked this because she couldn't believe that Kang Min really wanted to help Yeon-woo. Meanwhile, the teenagers were descending the stairs, and Kang Min tried to reassure them that they had to do it. People around them were screaming and running to the ground floor. The guys heard someone say that the police had blocked the exit, and this made them wary. The crowd gathered at the door and shouted at the soldiers, and the military tried to explain that it was an emergency. They wanted to convey that it was all for their own safety, but one of the men was not happy with this. Song-yeona stood nearby and watched what was happening. Kang Ji-hoon approached her and scared the girl. Seon-young began to resent the fact that they could not leave the church now, but she did not know what had happened. There were more and more people at the exit. Indignation and shouting grew. Then the other teenagers came out, and Park Choa was surprised that Kang Ji-hoon had come. The girl said she thought it would be for a long time. It turned out that it was all because of the dead pigeons in front of the church. Their cells could be dangerous and cause mass infection. Meanwhile, 2 men were carrying a canister inside. 2 women also came in, holding hands because one of them was not feeling well. Sung-yeon passed by these women and shouted indignantly that they could not leave the church. The girl could not see anything in her path, so she hit one of the women with glasses with her shoulder. She fell to the floor, but Song-yeon responded by accusing the women to watch where they were going. The victim only managed to look up and apologize, and her friend scolded Seung-yeong. The sister helped the woman with glasses and led her into the room because she wanted to pray. Meanwhile, Kang Min tried to prove to Kang Ji-hoon that the heat was causing the cells to die and blocking the chance of spreading. But no one listened to him, so he turned to Park Choa and asked her to listen to him, asking why they thought about their lives, and just left everything as it was. The girl sarcastically said that one could go crazy how interesting everything was. And then she asked what the woman was doing with the canister. Kang Min approached her and offered to help. She was very pleased with the young man's help and ordered him to carry it right up the stairs. But Kang Min suddenly stopped and took his time to relate everything. He was carefully examining the tank he was holding. Then he stopped the woman and asked if he could ask her a question. He wanted to know if it was hot water in the tank. Meanwhile, the events moved to some underground place that looked like an underground parking lot. Inside, there were partitions in the form of grates. The room was surprisingly clean without any virus cells, but very empty. Park Jun cautiously walked out and approached the grate. Then he tapped it with his finger. A guy with long dark hair appeared from behind the wall. Park Jun immediately waved to him and called him his bro. Then the guy waved back when he recognized his friend. They opened the grate for the newly arrived company to enter. The boy waved to the girl because he was surprised that she had come, but his friend did not greet him very warmly. She only said that another one had come with him. The guy asked who it was, and Jeonwoo stood in front of him and didn't say a word. Park Jun said that they just came to get his things and that he had written to him. The boys were walking in a hug and discussing something of their own. My brother asked Park Jun if they had filmed 100 people, but this question made him panic and he looked back. Park Jun looked at Yeon-woo and his reaction to the boy's words that they had only infected many people, and his friend just laughed at him. He asked Park Jun why he was so tense, but he was not speaking clearly and tried to change the conversation. Jeonwoo understood his behavior but did not react. He seemed to feel useful among these people. The teenager was only thinking about where they all got the cells. Lee Young-woo tried to focus on his feelings. Then he saw the cells right under the guy's sleeves, and the other guy felt a flamethrower from the infection. It was something else. The guy who saw them all off and asked what had happened to Jeonwoo's face and where he was from was looking at him carefully. But the teenager was silent, so the others answered that he was from Cheonan, and the boy added that Yeon-woo was from the same school he had once attended. Then, the man said that his younger son was there and asked him what Yeonwoo's name was. The teenager answered without looking up. The man started repeating his name, as if he was trying to remember something similar. Then the teenager looked up and looked at the man. He stopped, turned to Yeon-woo, and their eyes met. The man said he had an interesting name and asked if the teenager understood what they were doing here. Yeon-woo showed dissatisfaction with his whole appearance and looked closely into my eyes. The man asked what kind of expression the teenager had on his face and asked what he didn't like. But Yeon-woo looked down and thought that they were all just trash and scum. The man asked if Yeon-woo was really their friend. The teenager looked at the man's hands. They were infected and wondered why they were all still alive. Then she yelled at the man, saying that if he continued to behave like this, she would leave. The man was scared and began to back away, saying he was just joking and offering to work with Yeon-woo. The girl whispered to the teenager that if he made a fuss, he would not find his friend. She looked Yeon-woo in the eye and promised that she would help him find his friend and save him. But the teenager just walked forward, speeding up his gait. And then he added that there was only one piece of garbage here anyway, and the girl fell for this provocation and got angry. Meanwhile, the guy with the fire extinguisher was on the phone and chatting with someone. After that, he called his brother and arranged to meet. Yeon-woo's attention was drawn to the information that his school friend was also here. The events were moved to the 5th exit of the room. Leaning against the wall was a guy wearing a cap and holding a phone. It turned out to be Han Song-yu. He was supposed to be with Isuri and Kang-min, but it seems that their paths diverged then. Meanwhile, a company approached him, and he cheerfully greeted his brother. Suddenly, his joy turned to surprise when the company came closer to him. Han Seong-yu saw Lee Young-woo and his surprise was overwhelming, and he shouted out his classmate's name in shock. The company headed up the escalator to the exit. Han Seong-yu went first and told his brother that it was clean and without soldiers. The teenager spoke strangely, like a cattleman. Then he offered to smoke and move on. It seemed that Han Seong-yu was running away from something or someone, but they caught up with him, and Yeon-woo said he was glad the teenager was safe. He caught up with Han Seong-yu and added that he didn't expect to see him here when his classmate turned to him. A smile appeared on the teenager's face and he asked how things were in Yeonwoo and what was going on here. And then Han Seong-yu asked if that was the last time they had seen each other in a homeless shelter. He asked how Yeon-woo escaped and was not caught, and then apologized for that time, saying that Isuri had abandoned him. Han Seong-yu added that she was also looking out for him and asked if Yeon-woo realized this. Then the teenager asked who all these people were and whether he had communicated with them. Han Seong-yu said that it was his brothers who took care of him and they were very good in fact. Yeon-woo asked if it was true that they were just selling the cells to others. But Han Seong-yu just laughed at all this and asked where he had gotten his guesses from. And then he asked if Yeon-woo was really interested. Han Seong-yu offered to listen to his story. He asked Yeon-woo if he knew how the gang obtained the cells. The teenager turned and looked at his classmate, and he said that it was all about arguments, and that they had produced a mutant. A smile appeared on Han Seong-yu's face. Meanwhile, the events moved to the church. Behind the glass was a hall where everyone prayed and held services. There was no one inside, but we could hear prayer. The woman with the glasses was sitting behind me, reading the prayer as she wanted. She was trembling, but believed it would help her. The woman looked at the cross hanging on the wall. Virus cells suddenly began to appear on her face. Unfortunately, prayer did not help with such things. 2 women came inside, not noticing anything and just talking to each other. But when they went deeper, they froze in shock and fear. In front of them was a huge monster that resembled a bird with large bone-shaped wings. Meanwhile, the pastor prayed and cried. He said that he saw and heard the voice of angels surrounding the throne of God. Other people prayed with him, and on the ceiling hung a huge monster, wrapped in a cocoon. One woman lifted her head slightly and opened her eye to look at the monster. The prayer said that their sister had performed a miracle with her sincere faith. Then the pastor opened his eyes, looked at the monster, and said that she had been born in the form of an angel by the voice of the Lord. Amen. Meanwhile, the blogger's video about the Khan River said that it was dangerous and many people died there. Isuri was sitting in the hallway watching him. The guy was talking about immunity and more specifically about Lee Young-woo. The girl watched and listened carefully to what the blogger was saying. If before it was nonsense, now it was the opposite. The guy said that in the future they would face something worse than incubation. He argued that as generations changed, species also changed, so we should stop panicking. Isuri, meanwhile, came down the stairs and walked somewhere with a stony face, thinking about the blogger's video. She met Kang Min, and the teenagers simultaneously rushed at each other with questions about what they were doing. The guy asked Isura if she had anything like a thermos. Kang Ming pointed to the hot water tank, and the girl indignantly asked why he was experimenting here. But the guy was angry about it, saying that he was trying to save them, not conduct experiments. Isuri looked silently at her friend and his indignation. Meanwhile, outside, soldiers burned all the cells left by the pigeons. For one bird, 2 soldiers and flamethrowers were too many. Behind the glass, a crowd of people stood and watched carefully what was happening outside, because they would not be released until everything was clear. Kang Ji-hoon stood behind me and listened to everything people were saying. The teenager watched the soldiers work carefully. He seemed to sincerely enjoy it. Suddenly, he noticed something terrible. His eyes widened and his heart beat faster. A girl was sitting on the floor in the middle of the fire and was being burned alive. Kang Ji-hoon began to make his way through the crowd and shouted for everyone to stop. When the teenager got closer, he carefully examined everything that was happening. But now there was no girl among the fire. Then Kang Ji-hoon simply turned around and walked away. The crowd stared at him in outrage. Suddenly, someone called out to the teenager and asked if he was going alone. It was Isuri. She asked if Kang Ji-hoon knew about denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. Then she told him to do a self-diagnosis and determine what stage he was at. Kang Ji-hoon came back and asked what Isuri meant. The girl said that the teenager was still angry and added that Lee Yeon-woo was not joking. Kang Ji-hoon did not listen any further and simply walked away, giving his classmate the middle finger. But Isuri went on to say that Lee Hong-mi could be brought back to life and asked if this was not a denial of reality. She went on to say that people died and were born, and zombies and infection. But Isuri didn't have time to finish, because Kang Ji-hoon interrupted her and came very close, asking why the girl was not infected. The teenager became very angry, accusing Isuri of not even being near the Han River. And if she was ready to save Yeonwoo, she could go and do it herself. But Isuri asked why she had to do it, explaining that she was just curious. Kang Min and Park Choa were coming up the stairs from below, and they didn't hear the whole conversation, but they understood that there was a quarrel. The classmates ignored them and continued to argue. Kang Ji-hoon told Isuri to be straightforward and say how long they were going to pick on Lee Young-woo, but the girl with the calm face and voice said that it would be as long as it took, and asked in response how long Kang Ji-hoon was going to suffer with the bullshit. Then the teenager lowered his head and just laughed. He said he was sick of it all. His voice said that something terrible was about to happen. Kang Ji-hoon's teeth clenched, and he said through them that Lee Yeon-woo was just a scumbag who ran away. And this thought just tore him apart. Meanwhile, soldiers were climbing the stairs and their footsteps could be heard. Kang Ji-hoon wanted to continue his monologue about hating Yeon-woo, but they were interrupted. Soldiers came and asked the teenagers to get out of the way. They stopped the people praying over the monster, and the pastor wanted to stop the military. The soldier said they had a report. The pastor did not like this very much and asked again indignantly. The soldier asked if there were any infected or monsters in the worship hall, but the shepherd sharply and quickly began to deny it, saying that no one was inside. In fact, he lied, and his reaction gave the man away. At that moment, another pastor was sitting right next to the monster and praying loudly. The man ended the prayer with an oath of loyalty to God. At that moment, he opened his eyes, and the monster growled. The monster looked directly at the shepherd. Strange sounds from the worship hall reached the military, whom the believers tried so hard to stop. Then, the soldiers had to use brute force to make them all disperse and make way for them. The soldiers opened the doors of the hall and immediately pointed their weapons in case they were infected. But what they saw simply stunned them. At first glance, the hall looked empty and clean, but the sounds were coming for a reason. Then people behind the soldiers started screaming in terror. In the other corner was a cluster of cells, and they understood what it meant. People began to flee and break through the military. Kang Min and Isuri noticed this as they approached the worship hall. Meanwhile, the events moved to the stairs. Someone was sitting alone by the bulletin board. It was Kang Ji-hoon. He went downstairs to be alone and calm down. He turned around and looked at the board and what was written on it. There were various prayers and instructions. Park Choa suddenly approached the teenager and asked if he had prayed. Without waiting for an answer, the girl called Kang Ji-hoon strange and said that Jesus would not help them now. The teenager just swore. Then Park Choa asked if he felt guilty. Kang Ji-hoon turned and looked at the girl, and she continued that the teenager was exhausted. After that, she just turned around and left, saying that she would come back later because she wanted to go downstairs. Kang Ji-hoon didn't say anything, and just thought about Park Choa's words. The girl kept walking but did not turn back. Suddenly she stopped because she suddenly remembered that she hadn't seen Seon-young for a long time. Park Choa was walking down the hallway looking for her classmate. The girl opened one of the doors, entered, and called out to Seon-young. Suddenly, Park Cho stopped and stood in a stupor at what she saw. In front of her was a huge monster that ate people. The monster was busy and didn't notice Park Choa. Then she decided to immediately cautiously flee the premises. Cold sweat ran down her face and she kept looking back to control the situation. Park Choa literally tiptoed out of the room and walked down the hall. At that moment, Kang Ji-hoon came in and loudly asked Park Choa where everyone had gone. He continued to speak, but when he saw the expression on his classmate's face, he abruptly stopped talking. The girl had no face, it just screamed danger and fear. She quietly ordered Kang Ji-hoon to stand still and not move. Cold sweat was running down her face. The teenager froze and did not even breathe. Meanwhile, the monster in the room heard something and was distracted. At this point, the monster broke the glass and attacked Park Choa, but the girl quickly reacted and began to run away. The monster landed in the corridor and looked at the teenagers who were running away from it. Kang Ji-hoon and Park Choa started running as fast as they could. The boy asked what it was, but the girl didn't know and just ran away. The monster was in no hurry to run after them and just growled. Then he shouted so loudly that the whole church seemed to hear it. Kang Ji-hoon also heard these sounds and turned back in shock. The teenagers were climbing up the stairs and the boy was surprised because the monsters couldn't be inside. A soldier was standing upstairs and he radioed that he was on the 3rd floor and was assessing the situation. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps and shouts from teenagers. They ran up to the man and shouted that a monster was chasing them and that everyone had to get out of the room as soon as possible. The soldier was in no hurry to run and wanted to understand what was happening, but there was nothing behind me on the stairs and no sound of a monster. The man didn't seem to believe them very much, saying that he hadn't seen anyone but them. But Kang Ji-hoon tried to persuade him to run away. At this point, the man seemed to agree, but the distrust remained, and it was then that the monster caught up with them. When the soldier noticed him, it was too late. The monster attacked him, and the teenagers hid in fear. They fell to the floor and gasped loudly, coming to their senses and realizing that they were alive. When the teenagers returned, they saw a huge monster attacking a soldier. Suddenly, it started talking to them. The monster turned its head and said not to be afraid of it. But the teenagers reacted to these words by running. They took off right away and ran as fast as they could. The monster was not in a hurry to follow them and just stood over the body of the soldier. The teenagers kept running and did not turn back. The monster opened its mouth. After that, it screamed loudly again. Meanwhile, the events moved to the worship hall. People gathered around the priest. Believers put their hands over their mouths in shock and despair. The pastor was covered in cells and virus. He did not move and showed no signs of life. Kang Min and Isuri were sitting behind me, listening attentively to everything the soldiers said. And the guy was filming everything with his phone camera. Kang Min suggested that when the man prayed, he was swallowed up. Isuri told them that they had better deal with everything quickly, because the door was closed. The girl thought further that the monster was inside, and that the priest had allowed himself to be infected. Isuri started looking around the room and noticed a window. She assumed that there was a window inside and that it was possible to leave through it. Kang Min supported him, saying that something strange had happened here, and that it was most likely that the priest was in the incubation period, and suggested that he leave. Suddenly, a strange sound was heard, and Isuri turned back. It seemed that these sounds were coming from the door on the other side of the room. Then everyone else in the room turned to the sound as well. People were just standing in a stupor waiting for something to happen. Then they started knocking on the door. After that, the sounds of laughing began to be heard, but it was unclear whether it was a monster or a person. The soldiers looked at each other. They signaled each other because they realized that the situation was strange and possibly dangerous. Then they started approaching the door with weapons. There was no sound outside the door, and this silence was only more frightening. Isuri and Kang Min hid behind him, and the boy continued to film everything that was happening. The soldier walked very carefully and slowly, pointing his weapon at the door. Then he reached for the handle to open the door. His heart was beating loudly. His blood pressure was skyrocketing, and there was tension in the air. After that, the man simply gathered his thoughts and opened the door. But looking around, everything was clear. The man looked in the other direction and was about to go back in because there was no threat. The soldier came back and told the others that there was no one there. Isuri stared open-mouthed at what was happening. She carefully examined the weapon in the soldier's hands. Isuri asked Kang-min what it was because she had never seen anything like it before. The boy explained that it was probably a flamethrower but made of gas. Then, suddenly, virus cells began to sneak out from under the bottom of the wall. The soldier heard the sound but didn't see anything strange at first. And when he returned, he saw that the cells had begun to make their way through and there were even more of them, and the man fell to the ground in fear. People inside also began to fall and turn back screaming. The believers froze, covering their mouths with their hands in fear and shock. Meanwhile, the cells grew in number and covered the entire floor. The soldier was shouting at his partner to make sure he had checked everything well. The man swore that there was nothing there. He didn't notice anything. Then, the cells suddenly started spitting and scattering their small parts on the floor. The soldier then shouted that where could these cells have come from and how did they get inside? The men started shooting back. A partner with a flamethrower opened fire on the cells. One of them ordered everyone to quickly run for the exit, and then he gave the order to burn everything in the room. But he was suddenly stopped by the pastor, who said that he could not burn down the entire worship hall. Another soldier also stopped his partner. They looked around. The cells were burning and no longer posed such a threat as before. The man exhaled and said that it was all very strange. Suddenly, the priest began to say that they had definitely cleared everything, and then he began to pray and ask the Lord for forgiveness for his sins. The soldier cursed and shouted at the priest, asking if it was the right time for prayer. He was saying that right now many lives were being lost, and they were sitting here praying. The priest said that it was a test of the Lord himself, and that they were all just sinners. Suddenly, virus cells began to drip onto the soldier's suit. They appeared as if out of nowhere, just from the ceiling. His eyes widened sharply, and his heart began to beat faster. At that very moment, a huge monster attacked him from the ceiling. The man did not have time to escape or defend himself, so he had to take the brunt of the attack himself. The monster growled and opened its huge mouth. Others began to quickly run away screaming. Suddenly, the monster spoke and said that I shouldn't have looked back and been afraid of him. The priests and other believers stopped and watched what was happening. The monster said that what they all saw was just his appearance. Suddenly, a face began to appear from under the cells. The other pastors were in a stupor because they seemed to recognize the man. The face spoke of their faith and that by the grace of the Lord they had chosen their weakness. One of the pastors was sure that it was their elder and asked the man about it. A soldier was climbing next to me and he fell when he ran away in fear. The man looked down and saw that his partner had been killed, but there was also a flamethrower next to him. The soldier began to run quickly to get his weapon. Suddenly, the tentacles of the virus wrapped around the flamethrower right in front of the man's hands. The monster turned to him and ordered him not to give in to the spirit of temptation. And then he told me to pray for repentance. This was all said by their elder. Meanwhile, Isuri and Kang-min were getting out of the room through that window when they heard loud screams. Isuri went back to see what was going on. The girl saw a horrifying picture of a monster devouring everyone who was nearby. Meanwhile, Kang-min had also climbed out, and the teenagers had almost escaped. Suddenly, someone distracted the monster's attention and he turned aside. It turned out to be a soldier on whom he had fallen. The man raised his weapon with trembling hands. After that, he wished me to die. Meanwhile, the teenagers got out of this madness and ran down the corridors as fast as they could. They ran through a room and Isuri said they had to find a way out quickly. But Kang-min asked in response what they were supposed to do with the others, and Isuri did not know. As they ran, they saw another monster ahead of them. He was the soldier who was infected by the monster. The teenagers decided to turn and run up the stairs, but unfortunately they reached a dead end and had nowhere else to go. Then, at the same time, they decided to go into one of the rooms and hide there. Kang-min was the last to enter and closed the door behind him. When the teenagers came in and realized they were safe, they calmed down and loudly laughed. They looked at the door as if they expected someone to come in and catch them, but there was no one and nothing there, and the teenagers were able to break away and escape. Then the classmates exhaled and relaxed to the end. Kang-min said they had to find the others. Suddenly he heard the sound of the phone ringing at that moment. It turned out to be Kang Ji-hoon. He called his friend and immediately asked where they were. Kang-min asked him the same counter question, and then asked if his friend could bring him something like fire. The teenager asked to hurry and said they were on the 3rd floor. But Kang Ji-hoon said that they were also in an ambush and that this monster was as if invisible. Then the teenager looked to the side and said that they had the same situation. Outside the door, he saw quarantine soldiers approaching the church. Kang Ji-hoon informed Kang Min about this. Isuri was eavesdropping on their conversation when suddenly something occurred to her. Kang Min continued to talk to his friend about something when Isuri called out to the teenager. She told him to hang up and look down. The look on Kang Ming's face changed dramatically. Her eyes widened and cold sweat ran down her cheeks. Isuri said that they had to find a way quickly, otherwise everyone would die, because the virus cells had begun to crawl through the door.